Hello everyone and welcome to Off-Grid Renewables, Energy Access and Remote Power, Current Trends and Future Forecasts with Peter Asmus from Navigant Research. This webinar is brought to you by Solar Media ahead of the 5th Annual Solar and Off-Grid Renewables Southeast Asia Conference, which will be held this year in Bangkok on the 20th to 21st of November. Just to introduce myself quickly, I am Emma Fell, I'm senior producer here. Peter Asmus is a principal research analyst with Navigant and has published over 30 reports on related topics since 2009. Peter has 30 years of experience covering the energy sector as an analyst, book author, journalist, and public speaker. Today, he will look at the latest trends in technology and business models for remote power applications, such as microgrids and nanogrids in the developing world, with a focus on Africa and Southeast Asia. We consider how the remote microgrid segment compares to other regions and market segments, arguing that these networks are vital to meeting global goals on sustainability, economic development, and climate change mitigation.
Well, hello everyone. This is Peter Asmus from Navigant Research. So to set the stage here, sort of why is this topic important? And this is a slide from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. It's conceptual, but it sort of makes the point that if the developing world sort of follows the same energy pathway that the developing country has followed in the past, basically what you're showing here is the sort of red dotted line shows the rise in emissions. So while the developed countries have been investing in renewable energy, both large scale and small scale, you see the emissions in the green going down. And if, like I said, the developing world would continue on sort of the path that's been historical, relying on centralized power generation, coal and nuclear plants, you can see that the emissions would go skyrocket, and then eventually we would have very high damage on the economy. And so what the thought is, why necessarily follow the same pathway? Why don't we do some sort of leapfrog development, sort of take advantage of some of the advances happening with technology such as solar PV, energy storage, and wrapping these technologies into both microgrids and then nanogrids. So this is sort of the context about why we're even talking about the topic today. So to grid or not to grid, I guess that's kind of trying to be a little clever here. So, you know, should we just expand the same grid or not? So Africa and Southeast Asia really represent large populations and in many cases not served by traditional power grid infrastructure. And so one solution would be, as I just sort of said, to expand these existing grids, replicating the centralized system. But as we've seen in the previous slide, that would result in super high emissions and ultimately in a lot of ecological damage. There have been some efforts to actually provide alternative systems. A lot of that's funded by organizations such as the World Bank and other NGOs. And typically what they've done in the past is they've funded simple solar home systems, or they've supported existing diesel-only remote power systems. Those have sort of been the dominant two ways to bring energy to the developed nations absent expanding the grid. And while in some ways you could argue those are good first steps, obviously they do provide some power, and in some cases do rely on renewables, I don't believe they actually represent a sustainable long-term solution. So what should we do instead? I think what we need to do instead is design a deployment strategy that anticipates the evolution of clean energy technologies, thereby limiting future potential stranded assets. Now, what does that really mean? What I mean is if indeed we install a lot of solar home systems, what happens when those grids start growing organically and start touching each other? Have we really thought about how that's all going to be integrated? Will those systems be compatible, for example, or will we leave a number of stranded assets and basically have to start all over again? So I think to avoid that kind of situation, what we need to do is leverage new business models as well as service delivery platforms and install superior sustainable power systems that make economic sense. So in other words, rather than relying on systems that will constantly need subsidy well into the future, might it be better to develop some business models that take advantage of private capital as well as public capital, and also a format where the service delivery will actually make sense for the end-use customer. And the vision is we will have sort of networks of both nanogrids and microgrids that leverage the appropriate scale solutions in which can accommodate these future organic grid growth patterns. Now, I haven't really defined nanogrids or microgrids, and I know the term that's often used actually is another term, mini-grid. But in essence, the way we define it is a nanogrid for an off-grid system is 5 kilowatts and below, and then a microgrid would be anything above that. And I know in some ways other folks would call a nanogrid a microgrid, but that's the terminology we use. So hopefully that's helpful, but I'll go into more detail on that in the future. And so then the last bullet, use these remote power systems to foster economic development through installation and maintenance services, and even embracing radical concepts such as transactive energy. I bring that up because I've done some recent work in Australia, which traditionally has been a hotspot for off-grid power, although now it's also becoming a hotspot for grid-connected batteries and storage. But I was fascinated that one of the utilities there in Australia is envisioning ways to foster economic development by allowing the people that are being served by the remote power microgrid to actually trade solar energy. Now, I think there's a long ways to go, but the fact that they're thinking about that, I think, is really promising, and I think is pointing the way that some of these advanced concepts can be integrated into remote power systems. So what kind of partnerships are needed? We're going to do a poll here. We'll see how this one goes. Asking people which one of these 4 categories do you think is the most important for market success? 1, global funders, 2, large technology providers, 3, smaller technology specialists, and 4, local market actors. So please vote, and then we will somehow figure out how to tell you the results. So the global funders, these are the government finance these are entities that provide government financing or loans. We have a lot of foundations. The Rockefeller Foundation, and for one, has been very active in this with its EBC model, sort of revolving around cell phone towers. I think it's very promising. Venture capital, another source of funding. And then there's also the incentives for clean energy technology. Second category, large technology vendors. These are familiar names. These are some of the large companies all involved in the microgrid space. Among them, ABB, Siemens, GE are some that come to mind. There's many, many others. Companies that can offer a complete solution, and these are also companies with a big balance sheet to sort of back up projects and sort of enable financing to occur because they are backing them up. And then there's the category of smaller technology specialists. These are often vendors that just provide some power electronics and controls, maybe in the form of a smart inverter. There's also some really innovative companies coming up with smart meters specifically designed for off-grid power. Companies that come to mind, one is Spark Meter, which I think is very interesting. I know they've been involved with at least 30 to 40 microgrids at last count. And then there's the actual local solar PV installers. And so that's another category. And then the next category is the other local market actors, and these include the utilities themselves that may exist in these areas, even if the customers are not yet connected to the grid. C&I customers, remote mines, and other sort of facilities, community-based institutions that might help organize or represent the end users, and then actual local citizens themselves. So now we're going to check the poll results. I guess, Emma, maybe you'll have to step in and announce the poll results.
Yeah, so the results we have here is in the first, oh God, it's jumped to a point. The top one was 48% local market actors, and next up was 25% smaller technology specialists, and then global funders at 19% and 8% large technology companies.
Okay, very interesting. All right, let's go to the next slide. So why is sustainable resiliency now possible? Why is this such a hot topic to now? Well, according to the UN, and I may add other organizations, remote off-grid microgrids probably offer the best hope for the developing world. And And what they like to often say, and I often like to say as well, is the sort of idea of looking at cell phones and how cell phones sort of help leapfrog the telecom industry. So rather than installing landlines and all of the infrastructure required for landlines in the developing world, just going to sort of a distributed cell phone model. And that's what I guess I am also advocating. What's nice about these systems is they provide solutions not only for climate change, but also ending energy poverty. There's been a lot of innovation with sort of modular pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-grow business models, which seems uniquely situated for especially village power, where there isn't a lot of capital. But because the cell phones have already been introduced, that's how people pay for services. It's enabling transactions, small business development, and then the same model can sort of be applied to energy services. I would say that if you look at all the different opportunities within the developing world, the most financially attractive opportunity in general are going to be a physical island. And the reason I say that is that these islands are generally of sufficient scale to make economic sense. There's often a single utility. The single utility might not have a lot of capital, but it does have access to the customers. It is the source of the tariffs. And so if one can focus on an island in an ideal world, that's probably a great place to start. Global climate change related extreme weather events is really building support for microgrids. That's the whole reason North America has emerged as the largest grid-connected market. But now what happened to Puerto Rico is also generating a lot of interest there because there's so much damage. In some ways, you can sort of start with a clean slate, and perhaps that clean slate would focus on microgrids rather than traditional grid infrastructure. And this is just a note here, noting that there's many private sector giants are examining prospects in Africa, spin-offs and different parts of these companies. A lot of Europeans are really focused on the African market. Here's an interesting chart that I think I always like to use. It's sort of showing the combination of increase in cell phone usage in Africa and a decline in solar PV prices. This is actually a bit dated, so now I think if you would target the solar PV prices, it would actually be lower than this. I think what's interesting is that every single forecast about solar PV has been wrong, and in almost every single case they've grossly underestimated the growth in solar and the decline in cost. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we think about remote microgrids as well as nanogrids. And let's see here. So here now we're going to get to some data. We at Navigant Research, we do publish a what we call our microgrid deployment tracker. It's the only data set that anyone publishes that looks at the global market. We admit that it's never complete, and in fact every time we publish one we know it goes out of date essentially, and it is dependent on getting data both through public sources, through surveys, through vendor interviews. And so it is imperfect, but it does provide us with the data that's available and kind of provides a snapshot of the market. So this is data from the second quarter of 2017. This does not include nanogrids. It's just focused on microgrids. But I think what's interesting here is you notice that the remote segment is by far the largest. This is a global tally here, and in essence, I think we've identified upwards of 16 gigawatts of microgrid capacity globally. You can see the other segments are sort of scattered about. I mean, there's no other dominant one. I think the biggest surprise here for many people might be the utility distribution category, but I have to tell you that these are not necessarily all online. So this is operating, under development, and proposed microgrids. Those are the categories we include in the data set. Switching over to a regional breakout, I think what happened here in the last update is that the Asia Pacific region actually surpassed North America, and that's primarily because of some more data from Asia Pacific with some larger industrial scale off-grid systems. And again here, the Middle East Africa looks fairly small, And that's because we actually believe it's been historically more of a nanogrid market than a microgrid market, but we do believe that's about to change. So you could sort of say that Asia Pacific and North America are sort of neck and neck as the global leaders. And actually, I think in the future, when we look at our future forecasts, that's what we're going to have. So I guess I forgot to do the poll here. So I'm wondering, are people surprised by the difference in market share between Asia Pacific and Africa, Middle East? That's the poll. It's a simple yes and no. I think Emma can announce those results as soon as they come in. Probably should have said that a little earlier, but my excuse is I'm still waking up. I have a little more coffee here. And I'll just go to the next slide here. Emma, you can just chime in if you get some results.
People are still voting, but I think the final vote would be 62% yes, 38%. Oh, no, 40% no, 60% yes.
Okay, that makes sense. According to the laws of mathematics, so that makes sense. Okay, so what about the future? Here is our forecast. This is from a report we published in 2015. We update our global market forecast every 2 years, so the next update is actually coming right up in the first quarter of 2018. But this combines both microgrids and nanogrids, and if you look at this, you can see that the market is a little more balanced, although it is still the Asia-Pacific region that looks as the market leader. But you notice here, if we combine both both nanogrid and microgrids, that the Middle East Africa area is much better represented. You can see that the smallest market is Europe. That's primarily because most of Europe, a lot of the renewable energy development has been done based on a feed-in tariff model, which actually kind of precludes microgrids in many cases. Also, Europe, the markets are more integrated, and it's a much more larger focus on virtual power plants. Most of the microgrids in Europe that we've identified have actually been physical islands, such as the Canary Islands and islands in the North Sea. So this is our sort of big view, and it's a big market as we're projecting. But again, we review our assumptions every 2 years, and I know that one of the main changes in our updated forecast is that the cost per megawatt of these systems is declining rather rapidly, even just within 2 years, due to the declining costs of solar PV and energy storage, as well as wind. And so the question is, will that decline in price stimulate further growth because it's more cost effective? And that's something we will be figuring out here in the future. So here, if we just look at microgrids, notice again that Asia Pacific is the market leader, and this is just looking at the growth there. And so we can also see the differences in the different regions. Latin America, I haven't said anything about that. I do think that in some ways the hurricanes that hit the Caribbean are going to just cement that region as a leader in microgrids. I think the question there will be, how are those systems funded, given that, for example, even Puerto Rico, a part of the United States, has been deeply in debt. And there's a question, and I think it's really going to depend a lot on the private sector. Let's go to the next slide. So here, just looking at nanogrids and dividing that market between commercial and residential, with residential primarily including all the village sort of power systems, both on islands and in mainland systems. And you'll see that actually the residential market is quite a bit bigger. That's mainly because I think the commercial systems are of larger scale and more attractive, especially for larger vendors. But in terms of the sheer scale of the opportunity, it's energy access that's going to be driving the nanogrid market. The commercial entities will be looking more towards microgrids rather than nanogrids. And then here, we're going to have another poll. Basically, the poll is, which business model will be the most successful in Africa, 1, and number 2, Southeast Asia. So I guess these are 2 polls. If you want to do a poll for Africa and then 1 for Southeast Asia, and the 3 choices are power purchase agreement, pay-as-you-go, or utility rate basing. Those are the choices. So we will come back and see what those poll results are. So what are the challenges on financing? I think one of the main challenges for all microgrids globally is developing a more streamlined approach to microgrid design, implementation, and financing. Right now, one of the challenges is trying to reduce the soft cost and other customized engineering costs. I did a white paper last year with a vendor, a software vendor called Spray. That white paper is available for free online at both on the Spray website, and that's what their whole argument was, is the way to grow the microgrid market is to create what they called configurable microgrids, trying to make microgrids more plug and play. Another version of that is the concept of microgrids as a service. We'll also talk about a little bit later, but in general, it's trying to standardize microgrids. The microgrid vendors like to say, if you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid, but I think the wave of the future is we can't let every single project eat up a lot of costs in terms of custom engineering, and so that's a key part for the remote system. Another challenge is finding financing for the entire project instead of individual components. That also can shrink transaction costs. And then figuring out what's the best role for utilities in the development cycle, as well as ongoing operations of microgrids. Does it make sense for the regulated business? And actually that's what we often are limited to in remote markets. Or what about unregulated subsidiaries? In North America, we are seeing a lot of interest on the unregulated sides of utilities investing in microgrids and other utility service territories. So interestingly enough, they want to profit from the microgrid business, but not necessarily in their own service territory. And then as microgrid fleets grow, are utilities in the best position to do the O&M? For example, in Australia, there is a possibility that one state-owned utility could merge with another and have approximately 200 microgrids under its control and under its operation. That's a huge fleet of microgrids. What would be possible in terms of streamlining O&M costs if there were other sort of examples of that happening around the world? Who should I partner with on the financial side? How should deals be structured? This goes to the business case and the polling question, PPAs, pay-as-you-go, utility rate basing. And then what vendors are the best fit for each segment within each geography? And here again, it's going to be local labor and local benefits that are the key to sustainability. So with that, Emma, do we have any results from the other poll?
Yeah, so the which business model will be the most successful in Africa was 68% pay-as-you-go, and the next was PPAs, 26%, and utility-based rating at 10%. And for Asia, we were 47% PPAs, pay-as-you-go 26%, and the last utility rate basing was 28%.
Okay, very interesting. So, okay, well, let's continue here. Here, this is how Schneider Electric envisions a microgrid as a service. Now, this was designed primarily for grid-connected systems, and in fact, I hate to keep touting my own research here, but just completed a white paper with Schneider Electric looking at data centers as microgrid candidates using microgrids as a service. That is a white paper that actually is available on the Navigant Research website, and there will be a future webinar about this. But it's just a very simple diagram, but sort of shows you sort of the different relationships. You have the microgrid owner-operator in the upper left, and then you have the solution provider, which in this case could be a Schneider Electric, could be someone else. And then the value proposition there, as they framed it, resiliency, efficiency, and sustainability. You have the partners down below, and then microgrids as a service site facility with the OpEx being sort of a key. So the main idea of the microgrids as a service, you can think about it sort of as solar leasing, how it allowed the solar industry and the grid-connected world to take off because there was no money needed to be invested by the entity, by the consumer. A private entity installed the solar, promised you benefits in the forms of lower costs, and basically operated the system and had an incentive, therefore, for the system to operate optimally. So the same concept can be applied to microgrids, although a microgrid is more complicated than a solar system. And so the key will be the entity being the service provider takes on a certain level of risk. And so this will only work as if that solution provider does have good technology, but that, of course, increases the incentives to have good technology. So I think we're going to see more and more sort of models focused on this kind of thinking to grow the microgrid market in the near term, and I think that's why over the next 10 years we're going to start seeing more accelerated growth. And then here, again, this is something that was originally designed for grid-connected systems, but it does apply to remote power if you think about it. The role of the utility as a microgrid gatekeeper. The utility still plays a key role even in remote areas. So these are just showing the different sort of strategies a utility might play. On the left, we have sort of the passive, and on the right, active, and then on the bottom, obstructive, and on the top, supportive. So let's say, for example, a utility has grid extension plans into a specific region. Will they actually be trying to thwart the development of microgrids through various policies? You can see here sort of in the blue, they could impede interconnection requests. So on the lower part, they could also, if they want to be active, offer a competing product or service, develop some policies, again in the lower right. We're seeing more and more utilities, though, even in the United States, interestingly enough, moving into sort of the upper right quadrant where they're developing pilot projects. They are engaging in interconnection requests. They are actually impacting policy in a way that might support customer choice. And in the end, their goal would be to actually have their own product or service offering revolving around microgrids. So there, I would say that's the minority of utilities, but in the last 3 years, more and more people are starting to kind of crawl into that upper right quadrant. So what is the value proposition for microgrids? That's a good question. Here, I'm now summing up some work we just completed for the California Energy Commission. We have a 133-page report that will be available to anyone, but it will be published by the Energy Commission, and I believe it will be coming out in about 5 to 6 weeks. So before the end of the year, that's something you can look for. And what we mainly did, we did a lot of things. We did 26 case studies around the world, although we focused some on California because this is funded by California ratepayers, so that's who's going to benefit primarily, hopefully, from the research. But here are some of the value propositions we measured, and some of these things are not totally relevant to remote systems, but I think it's still of interest. So here they are: reliability, resiliency, transactive energy, bill savings or demand charge abatement, provision of capacity and energy services, provision of ancillary services such as demand response, reduction of carbon footprint, provision of non-electricity service, and then linkage to concepts like virtual power plants. During the course of the interviews we did, two others came up, two other value propositions. The two that showed up the most was electric vehicle charging and cyber security. So here's a chart breaking down the responses for California, for North America, and global. So I'm going to focus on global here, and I think we'll start at the top, where global, in terms of what's the value proposition, renewable energy integration was the top one, and that was also the case in California. Resiliency, a little bit lower in terms of global markets. That's probably because in many of these cases, these microgrids are not connected to a larger grid, so it's not quite the focus. At least that's not the way they think about it. Bill savings, tied it's also tied there with North America globally. Reduction of carbon footprint, that is the second largest driver for microgrids globally. And let's see here, it's interesting there. I think the other interesting thing where the global market led was linkage to virtual power plant, future transactive energy revenue, and then here a commanding lead in non-electricity services. And of course that does make a lot of sense because microgrids globally tend to be more remote systems and have to provide more than just electricity. They might provide thermal energy, including water. And just to illustrate that point, here's one of the case studies we did, and this will be included in the report. Sekamacao, I'm probably mispronouncing that island, in Singapore. It's actually a site for a landfill. You can sort of see the outlines here of the island where there's sort of an edge there. That's all being filled in with landfilled waste over time. It's an interesting project. ENGIE has partnered with Schneider Electric to create a 2.8 megawatt microgrid. It's going to be online next year. The DER mix includes solar, wind, natural gas, diesel, lithium-ion batteries. The most sort of novel element of it is that it's trying a multi-fluid approach to energy storage centered around hydrogen. There was a lot of hype about hydrogen and it kind of cooled way down, but I'm now seeing a few microgrids that are actually sort of realizing that hydrogen, especially in remote applications, there's still value there. This microgrid actually will consist of 4 modular microgrids designed to validate the value proposition for Southeast Asian markets. The primary technology breakthrough as part of this system is an algorithm for a virtual synchronous generator allowing for 100% renewable supply when there's enough renewable energy available. So this microgrid is, in other words, capable of running on 100% renewable energy. So here's some more conceptual diagrams. Basically, you can increase renewables up to 100%, make the most of available resources, and then transform your waste into free energy with biogas that can actually also provide cooking services and biofuels for mobility. So again, moving outside of just electricity, also including clean cooking and mobility, produce hydrogen from renewable energy resources, dispose of that additional storage capacity and putting it in terms of a fuel cell, and then again providing also hydrogen for transportation. So it's just one example, but it is in Southeast Asia, and it's going to be used as a model, and ENGIE hopes to sort of roll out this model throughout the region. So let's conclude. Both Africa and Southeast Asia represent major markets for remote power systems. As I mentioned, Africa has traditionally been more of a nanogrid market due to the sort of funding of NGOs and also focus on much smaller systems, and in some ways that makes a lot of sense. The populations tend to be a little less dense than parts of Asia Pacific, and there's even cultural preferences by indigenous peoples for smaller systems, more nomadic peoples. So it's a different sort of environment, and you have to take that into account as you're developing your technology offerings. Southeast Asia, more of a microgrid market, higher population density and predominance of island communities. Just think about a place like Indonesia. The key for long-term sustainability is more about the business models than the actual technology. But again, appropriate technology is also important. You don't want to have the most sophisticated system necessarily if there is no local labor that might understand the technology and be able to keep it operating optimally. Some examples of companies that have seemed to have figured this out, I mentioned Spark Meter, another one is PowerHive. PowerHive is here from the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm based, Spark Meter, Washington, D.C. They both have done some pretty innovative thinking about how do you scale up microgrids through smart meters and also through software that kind of can ideally identify and size the sites. Solar PV plus energy storage seems to be emerging as the energy platform of choice. But I would argue let's not all just do solar and energy storage. There's always the benefit of diversity. So it's really about trying to find what are the local resources available. Wind, biogas, hydro, and even tidal shouldn't be forgotten. Tidal is still emerging, but I know there are some microgrids that are actually wrapping tidal resources into their systems. It's always about maximizing the local resources. The vendor pool interested in this just keeps growing. I think I learn about new companies, if not weekly, bi-weekly. You hear about new projects. It's a very exciting time. I think success in these and other developing nation markets, referring to Africa, Southeast Asia, really hinges on the creative partnerships between larger global companies, local actors, as well as the other stakeholders I've identified. And with that, we can, I believe, open it up to questions. Back to you, Emma.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. While we were presented an excellent overview of activity and expectation for rural electrification in these burgeoning microgrid market. So next, we're going to move on to the Q&A section of the webinar, where I'll be putting a few of your questions to Peter. Just before we start, can I refer you to my screen? One second. What should be flashing up on the screen now is a discount code for all you webinar attendees, which will give you a 15% discount to our upcoming Solar and Off-Grid Renewables Southeast Asia conference. This is the 5th edition of the conference, and it will be delivering a full solar market update on opportunities and growth across the Asian region, with 2 streams covering PV projects both on and off the grid. We'll have over 50 speakers representing the full supply chain, including utilities and governments, and make sure to check out the website after the webinar and feel free to keep in touch with me by email if you have any questions. So that's the Q&A with Peter, and thank you for waiting. So I'm going to ask you to send in some more questions if you indeed have them, but I've got a couple here to start with. So wait 1 second. So first one is from Simon Batchelor. I agree microgrids are great, but in all my experience, governments and utilities don't think a network of microgrids is the best way forward. Hence, it would be great to be able to point them to a learned UN document. I guess that's more of a statement than a question. Have you got a comment on that?
Well, I can comment on that. Yes, I would agree that that's true, especially so when it comes to developed nation markets like in the U.S., although I was mentioning we see that slowly changing with some companies actually now, some utilities, I should say, actually deploying microgrids. I can name a few: Encore, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, Con Ed. There's a utility called also ComEd. So that is happening. I think in the remote power market, in some cases, the utilities are interested. Their challenge is they don't have the funding, so it's really more up to the private sector to sort of convince them or bring some money to the table, so to speak, to enact those programs. But I do agree that it's still a challenge. That's not what's coming first in their mind as the solution. Their first solution is going to be some form of grid extension. But I think we have to figure out a way where growing the microgrids and grid extension are not viewed as necessarily opposites, but is there some way where that could be harmonized in sort of a more of a longer term strategy?
Okay, another question from Simon Olivier. What is your feeling about the most successful business models for microgrids in Africa? So PPAs, pay-as-you-go, and utility.
Oh, I think in Africa it's because the systems are generally going to be smaller scale, except I guess for remote mines like in South Africa. South Africa is kind of a whole separate market compared to much of the rest of the country. I think for village electrification, pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-grow is the model that's going to make sense, and it's going to, in many cases, the ideal scenario is that it's leveraging investments in cell phone towers. Those cell phone towers then sort of become the anchors to future microgrids, and if they're DC, we haven't talked about this yet, if they're direct current, it's really easy to sort of modularly grow those networks and just add a little more solar or batteries as perhaps the population expands or business development expands. In terms of The other model would be remote mines actually doing a similar thing where maybe the remote mine starts out with a PPA with a vendor, but at some point communities are sort of growing, the labor force is sort of nearby those remote mines, and then those systems would be somehow expanded, and maybe you could even have hybrid systems where the original base infrastructure is a PPA, and then at some point there could be sort of a pay-as-you-grow. Maybe another vendor comes in and sort of works with that base infrastructure and gradually grows that out. But generally, I'd say pay-as-you-go is going to be the main. If you look at the entire region of Africa, I would say that's probably going to be the main business model.
Okay, and next question from Amin Nauri. Is there currently a commercial provider of hydrogen storage solution, that can be used for rural applications?
You know, I don't focus too much on specifically hydrogen in my research. I have a colleague, Adam Forney, who works with me in this field. His expertise is more on both fossil generators and hydrogen. I do know that the example I showed there with Engie is that seems to be a core part of their business model. So they're just testing it. As I said, that system will be fully operational early next year. So perhaps that's going to be part of their standard offering. And so we'll see. But I myself, I do know, for example, there's a microgrid located nearby, although now that I think about it, I'm wondering if it still exists, because some of you may have seen in the news there's been forest fires in Northern California, and this microgrid, I hadn't even thought about it until now, is located in that region. So it'll be interesting to see if that microgrid survived or if it still provided power when it was out. But it is also focused on hydrogen, mainly because the rules were not yet in place for it to sell extra energy back to the utility, and so it was trying to figure out what was the best business model, and they decided that it was generation of hydrogen for for vehicles. And so the short answer is I don't know of a lead vendor, but I do know that there's more focus on hydrogen, and it's been a bit of a surprise, and both in the U.S. as well as developing world markets.
Okay, next question from Carolyn Abella. What are your views on nano and microgrids in Australia? Where do you see the potential for new projects in short, medium, and long term?
I think actually Australia is, one could argue, is the place to be right now in terms of both microgrids and nanogrids. I would say traditionally it's been more of a microgrid market. You have a lot of mines in Australia. I was in Australia last year, and that's what I was struck by. So you have a lot of interest in larger systems, a lot of those developed by ABB, and a lot of them in the past being wind diesel hybrids. What's changing is the focus is shifting to solar, and because of that shift in focus, we are seeing more interest in nanogrids. There is a project where SunVerge, a company based here again in the San Francisco area, will be developing a 5-megawatt virtual power plant composed of at least 1,000 solar PV and storage nanogrids. So in that case, these are actually grid-connected solar homes with batteries, and then they're all going to be aggregated into a virtual power plant. So I think, but that's a grid-connected system. So in terms of off-grid systems, I see Australia as primarily being a microgrid market, and I see that there's a lot of interest there. And so, but actually in the grid-connected world, I see it as also a nanogrid market, but those systems would be aggregated into a virtual power plant.
Okay, a question from Mohammed Fassi Ferry. Could you elaborate more on how we can leverage cell phone towers to create microgrids?
Well, there's the Rockefeller Foundation has a whole program focused on that. They call it the ABC model of developing. It used to be called SPEED. I don't remember what that acronym meant, but the idea is that banks and financial institutions will invest in cell phone towers. It's such a big part of the market. It's the technology that the developing world and the developed world want. And so the idea is that those systems get installed. They're often not connected to a grid. So in essence, they're kind of planting the seeds for future grids. They're often low voltage DC power, direct current power, because there's no need to interact with a larger utility grid. And so the ABC model is that the cell phone tower is the A, is the anchor load, B is business. So it first might expand out to some small businesses where you maybe add additional solar or a battery. And then C stands for community. So the vision is first the cell phone tower, then expand to the businesses, and then expand to the broader community. Now that could also be done through AC, but I think the interest from a technology point of view would be the DC, because it's actually easier to sort of incrementally build out a DC system as opposed to an AC system. But that's the vision, and I think that is going to be a key, if not sort of one of the most vital ways to sort of bring energy access and microgrid, nanogrids. They'll start out essentially as nanogrids in many cases and then sort of expand into microgrids over time.
Okay, next question from Norbert Taphorn. What strategies can microgrid operators adopt to ensure financial sustenance or cash flows once the main grid arrives?
Once the main grid arrives, well, that's, you know, that's a policy issue. And again, this is the role utilities at some point are going to have to play, is that what I think is going to happen, and I started with this point about a longer-term strategy. The last thing we want is to invest in a lot of off-grid solar systems, and then once the grid arrives, you know, those systems are retired. So what I think we need to do is we need to think of sort of a sustainable strategy, and the funders need to start thinking about how do these grids grow organically, and once they start touching the existing infrastructure, what are the policies in place that would enable them, excuse me, to connect to those systems? So that's, you know, that's going to be a difficult situation. I am myself not personally aware of a model policy anywhere, although I think in India there's a lot of examples where there is an existing grid, but it's so unreliable that folks have put in UPS systems and now are shifting to kilowatt scale microgrids. So in that case, it could be that a place like India might be the sort of test case for developing policies, which essentially the idea is that those organic microgrids actually become part of the grid once maybe the traditional grid reaches them, or they just keep growing and growing and, you know, in essence create an organic grid composed of multiple microgrids. And so that's the vision. How to actually get there with the nuts and bolts, I think, is going to be up to policy and regulators.
Okay, and the next question is from Guy Randolph Gohor. What has been the major recent technical evolutions in microgrid, nanogrid in Africa, and who are the principal actors in the African market?
Well, actually, I'm going to revisit that. So I think in Africa the market is extremely fragmented, and the most interesting excuse me, players are actually some of the smaller vendors, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of large vendors are now eyeing that market, but in many cases they're not quite there yet, or they're only at the pilot development phase. So I can't really name names at this point, although we will be looking at that issue in some future research. But in terms of the technologies, I think broadly speaking, not just for Africa, but a lot of the key components on the hardware side have been commoditized. The solar PV, wind turbines, although smaller wind turbines generally have not received the same amount of interest as larger wind turbines, and for a microgrid, you're generally going to want a small or a medium-sized wind turbine. The inverters, there's been major advances in sort of smart inverters, and many of these systems will just be run off of an inverter. It'll be the brains of the microgrid, if you will. I think the key to the future is going to be sort of the linkage between metering and software and bill management, because you need to have sustainable systems, and the main way to do that is to be able to figure out ways to actually charge the entities that are consuming the power, and then figure out a way where they can actually pay for it, especially in developing nations where the end-use customer often doesn't have a lot of money, and that energy costs are such a high portion of their cost. So that's kind of a long, very long answer, but I don't really don't think I can really name names right now without doing a little more additional research. But the key is going to be sort of on the metering software optimization controls front. That's going to be the key to make these systems perform as promised. And then I'll layer on top of that is the business model, some version of pay-as-you-go, but in some cases also sort of creative forms of microgrid as a service, plug-and-play microgrids, and other concepts like that.
Okay, you've probably got time for maybe a couple more. Maybe a very quick one, because I've seen this question a lot. I think I might have asked you this myself at one point. So commercially, how do you classify micro versus nanogrids?
Say that one more time.
Commercially, how would you classify micro versus nanogrids?
Well, we've defined, there is no official definition of a nanogrid. It's actually a concept I first heard come up by a research organization called Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, although they said that every laptop is a nanogrid and every car is a nanogrid, and we felt that that definition wasn't very useful, especially as you try to forecast the future on electricity service. So we've defined a nanogrid, off-grid system, 5 kilowatts below, grid-connected system, 100 kilowatts and below, and generally serving a single load. So for us, a single building is essentially usually a nanogrid, unless it's larger than 100 kilowatts. We found that there's a lot of interest, and I will say that with nanogrids, there's a much heavier focus on DC power versus AC power. So for us, a microgrid can actually be anything larger than that. We have not set an upper size limit on microgrids, but there are a lot of questions. For example, what if there's an island, it's a single grid, but it has nuclear reactors and there's 1,000 or 2,000 megawatts? You know, I don't know, is that a microgrid? I think that's an interesting point of debate. But we have not set an upper limit on microgrids, although I'll say the largest microgrids that we've identified are generally 200 kilowatts, 200 megawatts and below. There's, for example, island of Aruba is, I believe, about 140 megawatt system, and that we are classifying as a microgrid, just as one example.